The smell of death had been following Robert Thompson for 3 months, but he was too proud to admit it was coming from inside his own head. At 3 a.m., Martha found him collapsed on their bathroom floor, 78-year-old hands clawing desperately at his right ear while black discharge pooled beneath his silver hair like spilled motor oil. "Bobby?" Her voice cracked the way it had 52 years ago when the telegram came saying he was missing in Korea. Same tremor, same fear, same awful certainty that everything was about to change. The putrid sweetness filled the small room, flowers left too long on a grave. Robert's weathered fingers came away bloody, and for the first time since Heartbreak Ridge, tears streamed down the face of a man who'd promised himself he'd never cry again. Martha's arthritic hands shook as she dialed 911, Parkinson's tremors mixing with pure terror. Outside, October rain hammered their bedroom window exactly like it had the night their grandson Billy was born premature. Same desperate rhythm, same race against time. What the doctors would find growing inside would shatter everything they thought they knew about pride, love, and letting go. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Robert Thompson had survived the frozen hell of Heartbreak Ridge in 1951, where Chinese bullets whistled past his ears and frostbite claimed 3 of his toes. He'd spent 40 years breathing steel dust at Bethlehem plant, watching good men die slow deaths from lungs full of metal shavings. But at 78, sitting in his paid-off ranch house in Millfield, Pennsylvania, he couldn't conquer a simple ear infection. "Turn that television down, Bobby," Martha called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the gentle authority of 52 years of marriage. She didn't know he'd already cranked the volume to maximum, that her morning humming had become a distant whisper, that the grandfather clock's faithful chiming had faded to silence 3 weeks ago. Martha O'Brien, Thompson, 76 and still beautiful despite the cruel tremor that had begun claiming her left hand 2 years prior, moved through their home with the practiced grace of a woman who'd raised 2 children and buried 3 parents. Early-stage Parkinson's, the doctors called it. Another battle they'd faced together, though Robert pretended not to notice when she hid her shaking hand in her apron pocket. Their son Michael, 45 and successful in his Chicago law firm, called every Sunday precisely at 2 o'clock. "How's Dad's hearing?" he'd ask, and Martha would glance at Robert reading his newspaper with the television blaring. "Oh, you know your father, stubborn as ever." She never mentioned the expired eardrops she'd found hidden behind the aspirin, dated 2019, or the bloody tissues Robert thought he'd concealed in the garage trash. Their daughter Sarah, 48 and a nurse practitioner at Millfield General, lived 20 minutes away but might as well have been in Chicago with Michael for all the help Robert would accept. "Sarah's got enough sick people to worry about," he'd mutter whenever Martha suggested calling her. "I'm not adding to her burden." The house itself told their story. Wedding photos from 1972, Robert's bronze star in a dusty frame, Martha's 30-year perfect attendance pin from First Presbyterian, where she still played organ every Sunday, despite arthritic fingers that sometimes stuck on the keys. Their mortgage had been paid off in 1995, same year Robert retired with a gold watch and a pension that seemed generous until medical bills started arriving. Billy, their 22-year-old grandson and Robert's fishing companion since the boy could barely hold a rod, was finishing his senior year at Penn State. Every other weekend he'd drive down in his battered Honda, and they'd spend Saturday mornings at Miller's Pond, where Robert taught him about patience, persistence, and the value of comfortable silence. These days, Billy did most of the talking while Robert nodded and smiled, pretending to hear every word. The garage still held Robert's 1987 Buick, meticulously maintained despite Martha's gentle suggestions about giving up his license. Next to his workbench sat a coffee can full of expired medications, some his, some Martha's, some belonging to neighbors who'd passed on. In his generation, you didn't waste anything, especially medicine that cost more than groceries. Outside, October's early frost warned of the harsh Pennsylvania winter ahead, and inside, two people who'd loved each other through 5 decades prepared for battles they couldn't yet name. The trouble began on a sweltering July afternoon when Robert decided to clean out the garage while Martha visited her sister in Harrisburg. At 78, he still attacked projects with military precision, sorting, organizing, discarding nothing that might prove useful someday. Behind a box of Christmas decorations from 1987, his weathered fingers discovered a small brown bottle, eardrops, expiration date March 2019. "Waste not, want not," he muttered, the Depression-era mantra his father had drilled into him. The drops looked clear enough, and medicine was medicine. Robert had seen boys in Korea treat bullet wounds with whatever they could find. Surely expired eardrops couldn't hurt an old soldier who'd survived Chinese mortars and 40 years of steel mill smoke. The pain had started 3 days earlier during his weekly swimming session at the Millfield Community Center. Billy had driven down from Penn State, and they'd spent Saturday afternoon in the pool with Robert teaching his grandson the backstroke he'd learned in basic training. "Keep your ears above water, Billy," Robert had instructed, then promptly dunked his own head to demonstrate proper breathing technique. That night, a sharp ache began deep in his right ear, like someone driving a railroad spike through his skull. But Robert Thompson didn't complain. Men of his generation endured. They persevered. They certainly didn't run to doctors over every minor discomfort. "Just swimmer's ear, honey," he told Martha when she noticed him tilting his head at breakfast. "Nothing to worry about." He'd seen it countless times at the community pool. Water trapped in the ear canal, causing temporary irritation. A few drops of medicine and everything would return to normal. But as July melted into August, normal became a distant memory. The pain intensified from a dull ache to sharp, stabbing sensations that made him grip the arms of his favorite recliner until his knuckles turned white. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by waves of agony that sent him pacing the hallway at 3 in the morning, careful not to wake Martha, whose Parkinson's medications finally granted her peaceful rest. "Bobby, could you speak a little louder?" Martha asked during their morning coffee ritual in early August. She sat across from him at the kitchen table they'd bought for their first apartment in 1972, her trembling hand steady enough to pour his coffee exactly how he liked it. Black, no sugar, hot enough to strip paint. Robert nodded and raised his voice, though he couldn't hear the difference himself. The television volume crept higher each day. Phone conversations became exercises in nodding and hoping for the best. When Billy called to discuss their next fishing trip, Robert found himself saying, "That's nice, son," to questions that might have required completely different responses. The discharge began during the 3rd week of August, a thin, yellowish fluid that Robert attributed to the ear cleaning itself. He'd seen worse in Korea, much worse. Bodies had remarkable healing abilities if you gave them time and didn't interfere with medical foolishness. He began carrying tissues in his shirt pocket, discreetly dabbing at his ear when Martha wasn't looking. "The TV's acting up again," Martha mentioned one evening in September, though she'd learned not to press when Robert got that stubborn set to his jaw. 52 years of marriage had taught her to pick her battles. If he wanted to pretend his hearing was fine, she'd pretend along with him. That's what love looked like at their age, protecting each other's dignity even when it hurt to watch. But the smell couldn't be disguised. Sweet and putrid, like flowers left too long on a grave, it began following Robert through their small house. Martha noticed during their evening ritual of watching the news together, though she said nothing. When had her husband begun to smell like something dying? The question haunted her as she lay awake listening to his restless tossing, the way he'd mumble and claw at his ear in sleep. Robert's morning showers grew longer, and he began using extra cologne, Old Spice, the same brand he'd worn since their wedding day. But beneath the familiar scent lurked something else, something that made Martha's stomach clench with unnamed dread. By late September, the discharge had darkened to an alarming black, thick as motor oil and twice as foul. Robert told himself it was old blood, natural healing, the body expelling infection. He'd seen soldiers recover from far worse with nothing more than determination and prayer. This was just another battle to win through sheer stubbornness. The expired eardrops became his secret weapon, applied twice daily in the privacy of their master bathroom. Each application brought temporary relief, followed by deeper, more persistent pain. But Robert had learned in Korea that medicine sometimes hurt before it helped. Healing required faith, patience, and the kind of fortitude that had built America. Martha found the empty bottle 3 days before everything changed, hidden behind the bathroom mirror alongside bloody tissues Robert thought he'd successfully concealed. She held the expired medication in her shaking hands, reading the date again and again, understanding finally why her husband of 52 years had begun to smell like death itself. Sarah Thompson Williams had inherited her father's stubborn streak and her mother's gentle persistence, a combination that served her well as a nurse practitioner but made family dinners increasingly tense. She sat across from Robert at their Sunday dinner table, watching him lean forward to catch fragments of conversation, his right ear tilted toward speakers like a satellite dish, searching for signals. "Dad, when's the last time you had your hearing checked?" Sarah asked, cutting her pot roast with surgical precision. She'd noticed the television's volume during her arrival, loud enough to rattle the windows, and the way her father nodded along to conversations he clearly couldn't follow. "Hearing's fine," Robert replied, his voice carrying the defensive edge that had emerged whenever anyone questioned his health. "Just got wax buildup. Happens to everyone my age." Martha set down her fork with unusual force, the sound echoing through their small dining room. 52 years of marriage had taught her when to stay silent and when to speak truth, even when it hurt. "Robert Eugene Thompson, your hearing is not fine, and we both know it." The use of his full name, reserved for serious transgressions since their wedding day, made Robert's shoulders tense. But instead of backing down, he straightened in his chair with military bearing. "I survived Korea without anyone fussing over every little ache and pain. I can handle a simple ear infection." "This isn't Korea, Dad," Sarah said, her professional training overriding family diplomacy. "And you can't treat serious medical conditions with whatever you find in the medicine cabinet. When did this start? What symptoms are you experiencing?" Billy, home from Penn State for the weekend, looked between his grandfather and aunt with the uncomfortable awareness that family dynamics were shifting in ways he didn't fully understand. At 22, he'd always seen his grandfather as invincible, the man who taught him to fish, to drive, to stand up for what he believed in. This frail-looking man, arguing about hearing tests, didn't match his childhood hero. "I'm not experiencing anything except a family that thinks I can't take care of myself," Robert snapped, pushing back from the table. The movement was too quick, causing him to wince as pain shot through his ear. He tried to hide the grimace, but Martha caught it, her expression shifting from frustration to deep concern. "Bobby," she said softly, reaching across the table with her trembling hand, "I found the eardrops, the ones from 2019. Hidden behind the bathroom mirror." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. Billy stopped chewing mid-bite. Robert's face cycled through emotions, surprise, anger, shame, defiance, before settling on the granite expression he'd worn through 40 years of labor negotiations. "Those drops are perfectly fine," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Medicine doesn't go bad like milk. It just gets weaker." "Dad, that's not true," Sarah said, her nurse practitioner training taking over. "Expired medications can be dangerous, especially eardrops. They can harbor bacteria, develop toxic compounds. You could have caused serious damage." "Damage?" Robert's voice rose, though whether from anger or because he couldn't hear himself properly remained unclear. "I'll tell you about damage. Damage is watching your buddy die in a foxhole because the medic ran out of morphine. Damage is working 40 years in a steel mill so your children can have better lives than you did. Damage is not using medicine that's a few years past its sell-by date." Martha's Parkinson's tremor intensified as family tension escalated. This was the first real fight they'd had about health, about aging, about the slow surrender of independence that terrified them both. "Robert, please. Sarah's trying to help. We're all trying to help." "I don't need help," Robert said, standing abruptly. "What I need is for my family to trust that I've been taking care of myself longer than any of you have been alive." Billy found his voice, surprising everyone. "Grandpa, you taught me that being strong means knowing when to ask for backup. Remember what you said about Korea? That the soldiers who survived weren't the toughest ones. They were the ones smart enough to call for support when they needed it." Robert stared at his grandson, seeing his own words reflected back at him. At 22, Billy possessed the kind of clear-eyed wisdom that cut through decades of accumulated pride and stubbornness. But acknowledging the truth meant admitting weakness, and Robert Thompson had spent 78 years defining himself as anything but weak. "That was different," he said quietly. "That was war." "This is war too, Dad," Sarah said, her voice gentling. "It's a war against time, against aging, against all the things that want to take you away from us before we're ready. But you don't have to fight it alone." The smell hit Sarah then, sweet, putrid, unmistakably organic decay. As a healthcare professional, she recognized it immediately, and her stomach clenched with professional alarm mixed with personal terror. This wasn't just an ear infection. This was something far more serious, something that required immediate medical intervention. "Dad, I need you to let me examine your ear," she said, already moving toward him. "Right now, as your daughter and as a healthcare provider." "Absolutely not," Robert said, backing toward the hallway. "I'm not some charity case for you to practice on." "Then you'll see Dr. Rodriguez tomorrow morning," Martha said with finality that surprised everyone, including herself. "You can choose to go willingly, or I can have Sarah call an ambulance. But this ends now, Robert." This pretending everything is fine when we can all smell the infection, when you can barely hear us talking, when you're in so much pain you haven't slept properly in weeks. The ultimatum hung in the air between them. 52 years of marriage distilled into this moment where love demanded action over comfort, truth over denial. Robert looked at his wife, his daughter, his grandson, all staring at him with expressions mixing love and fear in equal measure. For the first time since Korea, Robert Thompson felt truly outnumbered. The call came at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in early October. Michael Thompson was reviewing case files in his Chicago high-rise office when his phone buzzed with Sarah's number. In 45 years, his sister had never called him past 9 o'clock unless something was catastrophically wrong. "Mike, you need to come home." Sarah's voice carried the controlled panic he remembered from their childhood emergencies. "Dad finally agreed to see Dr. Rodriguez, and it's bad. Really bad." Michael closed his laptop, already mentally rearranging his week. "How bad are we talking? Scale of 1 to 10. Dad's ear infection isn't an infection. It's something else entirely, and Dr. Rodriguez is sending him to an ENT specialist immediately. Mom's barely holding it together, and honestly, I'm scared." The drive from Chicago to Millfield took 4 hours, but Michael made it in 3, his BMW eating up interstate miles while his mind raced through worst-case scenarios. He'd been so focused on his practice, on making partner, on building the kind of financial security his blue-collar parents never had, that he'd missed the warning signs his trained sister had caught during weekly visits. Guilt rode shotgun for every mile. Guilt over Sunday phone calls cut short by client emergencies, guilt over missing Father's Day because of a deposition, guilt over sending checks instead of showing up. He'd become the successful son his parents bragged about to their neighbors while secretly being the absent son who'd forgotten that money couldn't replace presence. Martha met him at the door of their childhood home, and Michael's heart broke at her appearance. In 6 months since his last visit, his mother seemed to have aged 6 years. Her Parkinson's tremor was more pronounced, her usually perfect silver hair looked unwashed, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone carrying too much fear alone. "Oh, honey," she whispered, falling into his arms with the desperate relief of a woman who'd been strong too long. "Thank God you're here. I didn't know what else to do." Robert sat in his recliner, the same chair he'd occupied for Sunday football games throughout Michael's childhood, but he looked diminished somehow. The proud man who'd taught Michael to throw a curveball and balance a checkbook seemed fragile, his right ear packed with gauze, his usual commanding presence replaced by something that looked dangerously close to defeat. "Dad," Michael said, kneeling beside the chair like he had as a boy seeking comfort after nightmares. "Sarah told me what's happening. I'm here now, okay? We're going to figure this out together." Robert's response came too loud, the way people speak when they can't properly hear themselves. "You didn't need to come all this way for an old man's ear troubles." "You've got important work in Chicago." The words stung because they carried truth Michael wasn't ready to face. How many times had he used work as an excuse to avoid difficult family conversations? How many visits had he postponed because a case seemed more urgent than his parents' daily struggles with aging? Billy arrived that evening, having driven down from Penn State despite midterm exams. At 22, he possessed the kind of fearless devotion Michael remembered feeling at that age, before career ambitions and geographic distance had complicated family loyalty. The boy, young man really, immediately took charge of practical matters with surprising maturity. "Grandpa, I talked to my professors about taking incompletes this semester," Billy announced over Martha's attempt at dinner. "I'm going to stay here and help Grandma take care of you while you get better." "Absolutely not," Robert and Michael said simultaneously, the first time father and son had agreed on anything in years. "Your education comes first," Robert continued. "I won't have my selfishness derailing your future." Billy looked at his grandfather with the direct honesty that only comes from genuine love, uncompromised by adult complications. "Grandpa, you paid for my first fishing rod. You taught me to drive. You came to every baseball game, even when your back was killing you from the mill. You think I'm going to abandon you now because some doctors need to poke around in your ear?" The appointment with Dr. Sarah Chen was scheduled for Thursday morning. Michael took time off, real time, with instructions to his secretary that only actual emergencies warranted interruption. He drove his parents to the medical complex in Pittsburgh, watching his father struggle with the simple act of walking from the parking garage to the elevator. Dr. Chen was younger than Michael had expected, with the kind of precise, confident manner that inspired trust. She listened to Robert's reluctant recounting of symptoms with professional attention, making notes while asking follow-up questions that revealed the true extent of his condition. "Mr. Thompson, I need to examine your ear canal with an otoscope," she said gently. "I'm going to be very honest. Based on what you've described and what I can smell, we're dealing with something more serious than a simple infection." The examination took less than 5 minutes, but Michael watched his father's face cycle through pain, embarrassment, and something that looked like relief at finally having someone take his suffering seriously. "Doctor." Chen's expression remained professionally neutral, but Michael caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested concern. "I'm going to need to run several tests," she said, removing her gloves with deliberate care. "Blood work, cultures, possibly imaging. Mr. Thompson, can you tell me exactly what you've been using to treat this condition?" Robert's admission about the expired eardrops came in halting, shame-filled sentences. Michael felt his own anger rising, not at his father, but at the stubborn pride that had prevented earlier intervention. Here was a man who'd sacrificed everything for his family's well-being, now risking his health because he couldn't bear to be seen as a burden. "Dad, why didn't you call me?" Michael asked during the drive home. "I could have helped." "I could have found you the best specialists, covered whatever insurance doesn't handle." "Because that's not how we did things in my generation," Robert replied, staring out the passenger window at the Pennsylvania landscape he'd called home for 7 decades. "We handled our own problems. We didn't run crying to our children every time something hurt." Martha spoke from the back seat, her voice carrying the weight of 52 years of marriage. "Robert Thompson, you are the most stubborn, prideful man I've ever loved, and that's saying something. But if you think protecting us from worry is more important than staying alive to worry about, then you're not nearly as smart as I thought I married." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of tires on asphalt and the sound of 3 generations grappling with the collision between old values and new realities. Independence had been the cornerstone of Robert's identity. Independence earned through military service, sustained through decades of manual labor, and maintained through sheer force of will. Asking for help felt like surrender. But over the following days, as test results came back and Dr. Chen's expression grew more grave, independence became a luxury Robert could no longer afford. The infection had spread deeper than anyone initially realized. What had started as swimmer's ear had become a complex fungal overgrowth, complicated by bacterial superinfection and made worse by months of inappropriate self-treatment. "We're looking at aggressive antifungal therapy," Dr. Chen explained during a family conference that included Sarah's professional input. "The good news is we caught it before it reached the inner ear structures or spread to the brain. The challenging news is that treatment will be extensive and recovery will take time." Michael found himself becoming the family's medical advocate, a role that felt strange after years of professional distance. He researched treatment options, called specialists, navigated insurance authorizations with the same intensity he brought to complex litigation. For the first time since childhood, he felt genuinely useful to his parents in ways that transcended financial support. The community response surprised everyone. Word spread through Millfield's tight network of longtime residents, and suddenly the Thompson home became a hub of casseroles, lawn care, and practical assistance. Mrs. Henderson from next door organized a meal schedule. The men from Robert's VFW post took turns driving Martha to grocery shopping and medical appointments. Pastor Williams arranged for visiting church members to provide companionship during the long hours of treatment. "I never realized how many people cared," Martha confided to Michael one evening as they sorted through cards and well wishes. 50 years in this town and I thought we were just keeping to ourselves. Turns out we were part of something bigger all along." Billy's presence proved transformative in ways no one had anticipated. His easy comfort with technology helped coordinate family communication. His youthful energy brightened the household's medical atmosphere. Most importantly, his genuine affection for his grandfather provided Robert with a sense of purpose beyond his own recovery. "Tell me about Korea again, Grandpa," Billy would say during Robert's worst moments, knowing that sharing war stories gave his grandfather a way to connect past strength with present struggle. "Tell me about the time you carried Tommy O'Malley back to camp." And slowly, painfully, with the reluctant acceptance that comes from having no other choice, Robert Thompson began to learn that accepting help wasn't defeat. It was simply another form of courage. one his generation had never been taught to recognize. The emergency room at Pittsburgh General smelled like disinfectant and desperation at 3:15 in the morning. Martha sat in the passenger seat of the ambulance, her arthritic hand clutching Robert's unconscious fingers while paramedics worked with practiced efficiency around his still form. The ride had taken 23 minutes during which her husband of 52 years had neither moved nor spoken, his face gray as old concrete under the harsh ambulance lighting. "Ma'am, we're here," the young paramedic said gently, his voice cutting through Martha's paralysis. Through the rear windows, she could see the hospital's emergency entrance, bright and sterile against the October night. This was the moment she'd dreaded for months, the moment when Robert's stubborn pride finally extracted its terrible price. "Doctor?" Sarah Chen arrived within an hour of the emergency call, still wearing scrubs from another patient but moving with the focused urgency that medical crises demanded. She found the Thompson family clustered in the waiting room, Martha wrapped in a hospital blanket, Michael pacing like a caged attorney, Sarah holding her mother's trembling hand, and Billy slumped in a plastic chair with the exhausted alertness of someone too young to fully process what was happening. "What can you tell me about tonight?" Dr. Chen asked, settling into the chair beside Martha with the kind of professional calm that either reassured or terrified, depending on your perspective. Martha's voice came in broken fragments. He was clawing at his ear, screaming. There was so much blood on the bathroom floor. I've never seen him like that, not even after Korea nightmares. It was like something was eating him alive from the inside. The examination took 45 minutes, Doctor. Chen emerged from Robert's curtained area with an expression that made Michael's stomach clench with anticipatory dread. In his legal career, he'd learned to read faces, to interpret the micro-expressions that revealed truth before words could soften or obscure it. Dr. Chen's face told a story he wasn't ready to hear. "The infection has progressed significantly," she began, her voice carrying the weight of medical authority tempered by human compassion. "What we're dealing with is a severe case of otomycosis, a fungal infection that's taken hold in your father's ear canal and external auditory structures." Sarah leaned forward, her nurse practitioner training translating medical terminology into frightening possibilities. "How severe? What kind of fungal organism are we looking at?" "Aspergillus niger, black mold fungus. It's created what essentially amounts to a fungal colony in his ear. The expired eardrops he was using created perfect conditions for this organism to thrive. The alkaline environment, combined with the breakdown products of outdated medication, provided nutrients for exponential growth." Michael felt his knees weaken. "You're saying my father has been growing mold in his ear for 3 months? The visual examination reveals extensive black fungal masses throughout the external auditory canal. There's significant inflammation, tissue necrosis, and secondary bacterial infection. Mr. Thompson is lucky. If this had progressed much further, we'd be looking at potential intracranial complications." Billy spoke for the first time since arriving at the hospital. "Is he going to die?" The question hung in the antiseptic air between them, raw and immediate in the way that only young people can ask about mortality. "Doctor." Chen's expression softened as she looked at the college student whose world was suddenly uncertain. "No, Billy. Your grandfather is not going to die from this, but recovery is going to be complex and lengthy. We need to begin aggressive antifungal therapy immediately, and there may be some permanent hearing loss in the affected ear." Relief mixed with new worry as the family processed this information. Not dying was obviously good news, but the word permanent carried implications that would reshape Robert's remaining years in ways none of them had considered. Martha found her voice again. "Can I see him?" Robert lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller than Martha remembered, surrounded by monitoring equipment that beeped and hummed with electronic vigilance. His right ear was packed with medicated gauze, and an IV line snaked from his left arm to a bag of antifungal medication that would become his constant companion for the next several weeks. "Bobby?" she whispered, taking his free hand in both of hers. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on her face with the confused disorientation of someone emerging from pain-induced unconsciousness. "Martha." His voice was barely audible, rough from hours of unconscious groaning. "I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry." For 52 years, Martha had been the emotional caretaker in their marriage, the one who smoothed over difficulties and maintained family harmony. But sitting beside her husband's hospital bed, watching him struggle with shame and pain, she felt something shift inside her, a fierce protectiveness that surprised them both. "Robert Eugene Thompson, you listen to me," she said, her voice carrying more steel than he'd heard since their early marriage disagreements. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. You got sick, you tried to handle it the way your generation was taught to handle things, and now you're getting proper medical care. That's the end of the story." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen's return, accompanied by a resident and a medical student who looked about Billy's age. "Mr. Thompson, how are you feeling?" Robert's attempt to sit up straighter was instinctive, the old soldier trying to present himself properly to authority figures, but the movement caused visible pain. "Been better, Doc. Been worse, too. I need to explain what we found and what treatment will involve. The fungal infection in your ear is extensive but treatable. We're starting you on intravenous antifungal medication today, which you'll continue for at least 2 weeks. After that, we'll transition to oral medications for several more weeks." Michael pulled out his phone to take notes, the lawyer in him needing to document and organize medical information the same way he approached complex cases. "What about insurance coverage? What are we looking at in terms of costs?" "Your father's Medicare should cover the basic treatment protocol. There may be some out-of-pocket expenses for extended antifungal therapy, but we have social workers who can help navigate those issues." Sarah asked the question that had been haunting her professional mind. "Dr. Chen, could this have been prevented? If Dad had come in earlier, when the symptoms first appeared?" The doctor's pause was answer enough, but she responded with careful honesty. "Early intervention would have meant simpler treatment and better outcomes. But I want to emphasize that your father's generation often approaches healthcare differently than younger patients. The important thing is that we're treating it now aggressively and appropriately." Billy had been unusually quiet, but suddenly he looked up from his grandfather's bedside with the kind of direct question that cuts through medical euphemism. "Grandpa, are you scared?" Robert studied his grandson's face, 22 years old, full of life and potential, asking the kind of question that demanded honest answers. In Korea, Robert had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was action in spite of fear. "Yeah, Billy, I'm scared. Scared I waited too long. Scared I might not hear you tell me about your adventures anymore. Scared your grandmother's going to have to take care of an old fool who should have known better." Martha's grip on his hand tightened. "Robert Thompson, in 52 years of marriage, you have never been a fool. Stubborn as a Missouri mule, yes, but never a fool." The family spent that first night in shifts, someone always present in Robert's room while others caught fragments of sleep in the waiting area. Hospital time moved differently than normal time. Minutes stretched during painful procedures, hours compressed during periods of medication-induced rest. Michael found himself thinking about all the conversations he'd postponed, all the visits he'd delayed for business reasons. His father lay in a hospital bed, fighting an infection that could have been prevented with earlier medical care, while Michael's law practice continued its relentless demands. For the first time in his career, he turned off his phone completely. Sarah coordinated with hospital staff using her medical background, translating doctor speak for the family and ensuring Robert received appropriate nursing care. Her dual role as daughter and healthcare professional created emotional complexity. She understood the medical implications better than anyone, which made watching her father's suffering even more difficult. By dawn, Robert's fever had broken, and the antifungal medication was beginning its slow work against the fungal colony that had taken residence in his ear. Doctor. Chen's morning rounds brought cautiously optimistic news. The infection appeared to be responding to treatment, though recovery would be measured in weeks rather than days. The next few days will tell us a lot about how well your body responds to therapy, she explained to the assembled family. Mr. Thompson, you're going to be here for at least a week, possibly longer. This isn't the kind of infection we can treat on an outpatient basis. Robert nodded, accepting this information with the weary resignation of someone whose choices had been reduced to medical necessities. The proud independence that had defined his adult life was temporarily suspended, replaced by dependence on family, medical staff, and medications whose names he couldn't pronounce. But as morning light filtered through the hospital room windows, something else was growing alongside the antifungal treatment. A reluctant understanding that accepting help wasn't surrender, and that family love sometimes required letting others care for you, even when every instinct fought against such vulnerability. The second week of October brought news that crushed what remained of the Thompson family's optimism. Dr. Chen's morning rounds had become a dreaded ritual, her professional demeanor growing more grave with each passing day as Robert's condition defied their most aggressive treatment protocols. The antifungal medications aren't working as effectively as we'd hoped, she explained to the family gathered in Robert's hospital room. Outside, autumn rain drummed against the windows with the same relentless persistence as the infection that refused to retreat from Robert's ear canal. We've tried 3 different antifungal agents, and while we've slowed the progression, we haven't achieved the clearance we need to see. Martha's hand found Robert's across the hospital blanket, her Parkinson's tremor more pronounced than usual after 2 weeks of sleeping in uncomfortable waiting room chairs and surviving on cafeteria coffee. The woman who had managed a classroom of 33rd graders for 25 years, who had organized church fundraisers and kept a family of 4 fed on a steel worker's wages, now felt helpless watching her husband's body betray him. "What does that mean exactly?" Michael asked, his lawyer's training demanding precise information even as his son's heart recoiled from the clinical terminology. He'd taken indefinite leave from his Chicago practice, a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago, but now seemed like the only sane response to watching his father suffer. "It means we're looking at more aggressive intervention options," Dr. Chen replied carefully. "The fungal colonies have created biofilms that are resistant to standard treatment. We may need to consider surgical debridement, physically removing the infected tissue from your father's ear canal." Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her nurse practitioner knowledge translating the euphemisms. "You're talking about cutting away parts of Dad's ear to get to the infection. What would that mean for his hearing?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Robert, who had been listening to this medical consultation with the stoic acceptance he'd learned in Korean foxholes, finally spoke. "Just say it plain, Doc. Will I go deaf in that ear?" Dr. Chen's honesty was both brutal and kind. "Mr. Thompson, there's already been significant damage to your ear structures from the prolonged infection. Surgery would likely result in complete hearing loss in your right ear, but it might be our best option for clearing the infection completely." Billy, who had been unusually quiet since dropping out of his fall semester to help care for his grandfather, stood abruptly and walked to the window. At 22, he was witnessing the slow dissolution of the man who had taught him to fish, to drive, to understand that character was built through small daily choices. The sight of his grandfather's deterioration was almost unbearable. "There has to be another way," Billy said, without turning around. "You're talking about taking away half his hearing to save his life. There has to be something else we haven't tried." Martha's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Bobby, what do you want to do?" Robert looked at his wife of 52 years, at his successful son, who had abandoned his law practice to sit beside a hospital bed, at his daughter whose medical training couldn't protect her from watching her father suffer, at his grandson, whose college education had been interrupted by family crisis. The weight of their love felt heavier than any burden he'd carried in Korea. "I want to stop being the reason this family is falling apart," he said, his words cutting through the antiseptic hospital air like shrapnel. "Sarah's exhausted from playing nurse to her own father. Mike's probably going to lose clients he's worked years to build. Billy's throwing away his education. And Martha," he looked at his wife, seeing how the stress had worsened her Parkinson's symptoms, "Martha's getting sicker taking care of me." The family's protests came simultaneously, a chorus of denial that Robert waved away with his free hand. "I'm 78 years old. I've had a good run. Maybe it's time to stop fighting battles I can't win." Martha's response came with the fierce authority of a woman who had loved the same man for more than half her life. "Robert Eugene Thompson, if you think I survived the Korea War, 40 years of steel mill layoffs, raising 2 stubborn children, and early-stage Parkinson's just to give up on you now, then you don't know the woman you married." But the medical bills were mounting beyond anything their Medicare coverage could handle. Michael's calculations, spread across the hospital room's small table, painted a stark picture of financial reality. Extended hospitalization, experimental antifungal treatments, potential surgery, and months of rehabilitation would cost more than Robert's pension and Social Security could absorb. "We'll figure out the money," Michael said, though his own savings were being depleted faster than he'd ever imagined possible. "Dad, you taught me that family comes first. Let me prove I was listening." The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when Martha collapsed in the hospital corridor. The combination of stress, irregular meals, disrupted medication schedule, and sleeping in chairs finally overwhelmed her 76-year-old body. Sarah found her on the floor outside Robert's room, conscious but disoriented, her Parkinson's tremor so pronounced she couldn't hold a cup of water. Robert's anguish was audible throughout the medical ward. "This is my fault," he kept repeating as hospital staff attended to Martha. "She's sick because of me. She's getting worse because I was too proud to see a doctor when this started." Dr. Chen took Sarah aside while Martha was being examined by the emergency room staff. "Your mother needs rest, proper nutrition, and stress reduction. Your father needs to understand that his recovery affects the whole family's well-being. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for our loved ones is fight as hard as we can to get better." The conversation that night, with Martha resting in a bed next to Robert's, marked a turning point in the family's approach to crisis management. Instead of tiptoeing around Robert's pride and Martha's tendency to minimize her own needs, they began speaking with the brutal honesty that genuine love sometimes requires. "Dad, here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice carrying the professional authority she used with difficult patients. "You're going to have the surgery. You're going to do exactly what Dr. Chen tells you to do. You're going to let us take care of you while you recover. And you're going to stop apologizing for being sick." Billy pulled his chair closer to his grandfather's bed. "Grandpa, remember what you told me about Korea? About how the soldiers who survived weren't the toughest ones, but the ones who were smart enough to use all their resources? Your resources right now are Dr. Chen, this hospital, and a family that loves you enough to fight alongside you." Michael's contribution was characteristically practical. "I've contacted a medical loan company that specializes in cases like this. We can spread the costs over several years, and I'll handle the payments. Dad, you spent 40 years providing for this family. Let us provide for you now." The decision, when it finally came, arrived not through dramatic conversation, but through quiet resignation. Robert looked around the hospital room at his family. Martha, pale but determined in the adjacent bed, Sarah reviewing treatment options with professional thoroughness, Michael coordinating insurance calls, Billy reading aloud from fishing magazines to distract from medical anxiety, and realized that his choice wasn't between independence and dependence. It was between fighting together and giving up alone. "Schedule the surgery," he told Dr. Chen during her evening rounds. "And, Doc, thank you for not giving up on a stubborn old fool." The night before surgery, Martha moved her hospital bed as close to Robert's as the room would allow. They held hands across the narrow space between beds. Two people who had loved each other through 5 decades of joys and sorrows, now facing the possibility that their conversations might sound different forever. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Martha whispered, "I want you to know that 52 years wasn't enough. I'd choose you again, Bobby. I'd choose this life, even with all the difficult parts, even with everything we're going through now." Robert squeezed her hand with what strength remained after weeks of medical procedures and pharmaceutical interventions. Outside their window, October stars shone with the same cold brilliance they'd shared on their first date in 1971, when they were young and believed that love could overcome any obstacle life might place before them. Tomorrow would bring surgery, uncertainty, and the possibility of permanent hearing loss. But tonight, they had each other, and after 52 years of marriage, that still felt like enough. The phone call came at 6:47 on a Thursday morning in late October, 26 hours after Dr. Chen had emerged from Robert's surgery with cautiously optimistic news. Martha, who had been discharged but insisted on staying in the hospital's family housing, answered on the second ring, her heart already pounding with the particular dread that comes when hospitals call before dawn. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Dr. Rodriguez from Infectious Disease. I need you and your family to come to the hospital immediately. We have some unexpected developments in your husband's case." The 15-minute drive felt eternal. Michael gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles while Sarah called ahead to ensure Billy could meet them at the hospital. Martha sat in the passenger seat, her Parkinson's tremor more pronounced than it had been in weeks, whispering prayers that had sustained her through 52 years of marriage to a man whose pride had nearly killed him. Dr. Chen waited for them in the consultation room adjacent to the ICU, her expression unreadable in the way that medical professionals perfect when delivering news that could shatter or heal. But something in her posture suggested developments more complex than the simple good news or bad news the family had braced themselves to receive. "Mr. Thompson's surgery went exactly as planned," she began, settling into her chair with the careful precision that preceded important revelations. "We successfully removed all the fungal colonies and infected tissue from his ear canal. The debridement was complete, and there were no surgical complications." Sarah leaned forward, her nurse practitioner training reading between the lines of medical speak. But when we sent the tissue samples to pathology for routine analysis, we discovered something unexpected. The fungal infection had actually been protecting your father from something potentially much more serious. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Martha's sharp intake of breath and the distant hum of hospital machinery that had become the soundtrack to their family crisis. Dr. Chen continued with the careful tone reserved for medical revelations that redefined everything a family thought they understood about their situation. "The tissue analysis revealed precancerous cells in the deeper structures of your father's ear canal. Cells that would have likely developed into squamous cell carcinoma within 6 to 12 months. Michael's legal training kicked in automatically, his mind racing through implications and questions. "Are you saying that Dad's infection prevented him from getting cancer?" I'm saying that the aggressive debridement surgery we performed to treat his fungal infection also removed precancerous tissue that standard screening would never have detected at this early stage. In a very real sense, your father's stubborn decision to self-treat with expired eardrops may have saved his life in ways none of us could have anticipated. Billy, who had arrived just in time to hear this revelation, sank into his chair with the stunned expression of someone whose understanding of cause and effect had just been fundamentally challenged. So, Grandpa's mistake actually helped him? Dr. Chen's smile was the first genuinely warm expression the family had seen from her in weeks. Your grandfather's immune system responded to the fungal infection by increasing blood flow and inflammatory response in the affected area. This probably accelerated the development of the precancerous cells to a point where they were detectable through our surgical intervention. If he had simply treated the initial swimmer's ear with appropriate medication, those cells might have remained undetected until they became invasive cancer. Martha found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. Is he going to be all right? The cancer, I mean. The cells you found? The margins were completely clear, Mrs. Thompson. We removed all the precancerous tissue during the debridement procedure. Your husband will need regular follow-up screenings, but his prognosis is excellent. The family sat in stunned silence, processing news that transformed Robert's medical crisis from a story of stubborn pride nearly causing tragedy into something approaching miraculous intervention. The expired eardrops that had seemed like such a catastrophic mistake had actually created the conditions for early detection of a cancer that could have killed him within 2 years. Sarah was the first to voice what they were all thinking. We need to tell Dad. He's been carrying so much guilt about causing this whole situation. He needs to know that his body was actually trying to save him. When they entered Robert's recovery room, they found him sitting up in bed, looking more alert than he had in weeks, despite the surgical bandages wrapped around his head. The antifungal medications had finally been discontinued, and for the first time in months, his color looked healthy rather than the gray pallor of chronic infection. Well, you all look like you've seen a ghost, Robert said, his voice stronger than it had been since before the surgery. Please tell me it's good news for once. I'm not sure my ego can handle any more medical drama. Martha took his hand, marveling at how warm his fingers felt compared to the cold clamminess that had characterized weeks of systemic infection. Bobby, we need to tell you something about what the doctors found during your surgery. The conversation that followed would later become family legend, the day that Robert Thompson learned that his greatest mistake had actually been his salvation. As Dr. Chen explained about the precancerous cells, about early detection, about the ironic protection offered by his fungal infection, Robert's expression cycled through disbelief, wonder, and finally, the kind of profound gratitude that comes from brushing unexpectedly close to mortality. You're telling me that those expired eardrops actually helped me? He asked, his voice carrying amazement rather than the shame that had colored his medical discussions for weeks. Billy leaned forward, his young face bright with the relief of seeing his grandfather's guilt finally lifting. Grandpa, remember what you always told me about fishing? Sometimes the fish you're trying to catch leads you to the bigger fish you didn't know was there. Robert's laughter was the first genuine sound of joy the family had heard in their hospital room. Billy, that's either the wisest thing you've ever said or the most ridiculous. I'm not sure which. Michael, who had been taking notes throughout Dr. Chen's explanation with the thoroughness that defined his legal career, looked up from his notepad. Dad, I've been thinking about something. All those years you told us that everything happens for a reason, that sometimes God works in mysterious ways. I never really believed it until now. The weeks that followed brought healing in dimensions beyond the merely physical. Robert's hearing loss in his right ear was complete as Dr. Chen had predicted, but the family discovered that communication had less to do with perfect hearing than they had imagined. Martha learned basic sign language. Billy became expert at positioning himself on Robert's left side during conversations, and Sarah found that speaking clearly and directly actually improved all of their family communications. More importantly, the medical crisis had forced conversations that might have remained unspoken for years. Robert's brush with mortality, first from infection, then from undetected cancer, had stripped away the polite distance that had characterized his relationships with his adult children. Michael's extended stay in Pennsylvania had rekindled the father-son bond that career success had inadvertently weakened. The financial strain, which had seemed insurmountable during the worst days of Robert's illness, was resolved through a combination of Medicare adjustments, hospital charity care programs, and the kind of community support that small-town America could still provide when circumstances demanded it. The VFW organized fundraisers, church members contributed to medical expenses, and neighbors who had known the Thompson family for decades demonstrated the practical love that sustained communities through individual crises. Billy's decision to take a gap year rather than return immediately to Penn State proved transformative for the entire family. His presence in the house provided Robert with daily companionship during recovery while giving Martha assistance with household tasks that her Parkinson's made increasingly difficult. More importantly, his young perspective helped his grandparents navigate medical equipment, insurance paperwork, and the dozens of small adaptations that chronic illness required. Dr. Chen's final consultation, scheduled for 6 weeks post-surgery, brought news that exceeded everyone's expectations. Not only had Robert's surgical sites healed perfectly, but his overall health had actually improved during the recovery period. The combination of proper medical care, family support, and the resolution of chronic infection had given him energy and mental clarity he hadn't experienced in years. "Mr. Thompson, I want to be very clear about something," Dr. Chen said during their last official appointment. "What happened to you was medically extraordinary. The sequence of events that led from swimmer's ear to life-saving cancer detection isn't something I've seen in 20 years of practice. You're either incredibly lucky or someone upstairs was looking out for you." Robert's response would become another family legend. "Doc, I spent 3 years in Korea dodging Chinese bullets and 40 years in a steel mill breathing metal dust. I figure I used up most of my luck by age 25. This wasn't luck, this was Martha's prayers finally getting answered." The drive home from that final appointment marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Robert sat in the passenger seat of Michael's car, his right ear permanently silent but his left ear attuned to every sound his family made. Martha beside him hummed quietly, a habit she'd maintained through 52 years of marriage. From the back seat, Billy chatted about his plans to return to college in the spring, and Sarah discussed her decision to specialize in geriatric care. For the first time in months, Robert Thompson felt like the luckiest man alive. Thanksgiving Day, 2024, dawned crisp and clear in Millfield, Pennsylvania, the kind of November morning that made the Rust Belt landscape look almost beautiful despite the closed factories and empty storefronts that marked decades of economic decline. In the Thompson house, however, prosperity was measured not in dollars, but in the sound of 4 generations gathering around a dining room table that had witnessed 52 years of holiday celebrations. Martha stood at the kitchen counter, her hands steadier than they'd been in months, carefully carving the turkey that Michael had insisted on buying from the expensive market in Pittsburgh. Her Parkinson's symptoms had actually improved during Robert's recovery, as if caring for him had given her body a purpose that transcended neurological decline. The stress that had nearly broken her in October had transformed into a fierce vitality that surprised everyone, including her doctors. "Mom, let me help with that," Sarah called from the dining room, where she was setting places for 8, the core family plus Billy's girlfriend Emma, Michael's ex-wife Janet, who had driven from Chicago to celebrate Robert's recovery, and Mrs. Henderson from next door, whose own family lived too far away for holiday visits. "I've got it, honey," Martha replied, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a woman who had reclaimed control over her own kitchen after months of hospital cafeteria meals and worried relatives hovering over every task. "Your father's been bragging to everyone about my stuffing for 50 years. I'm not about to disappoint him now." Robert sat in his favorite recliner, positioned so his good left ear faced the kitchen, listening to the familiar symphony of family preparation. The hearing aid in his functional ear amplified sounds he'd taken for granted before his illness. The gentle sizzle of gravy in Martha's cast-iron pan, Billy's laughter as he told Emma stories about learning to drive in his grandfather's Buick, the soft rustle of Sarah folding napkins with the precise movements she'd inherited from her mother. The silence in his right ear had become less jarring over the past month. Instead of feeling like a loss, it had evolved into a different kind of awareness, a reminder that every sound he could still hear was a gift he'd almost lost. Dr. Chen had warned him about phantom sounds, about the ways the brain sometimes filled in missing auditory information. But Robert had discovered that silence could be its own form of music when it was surrounded by the voices of people you loved. Billy bounded into the living room with the easy energy of 22 years and 6 weeks of dedicated grandfather care. "Grandpa, Emma wants to hear about the time you carried Tommy O'Malley through the snow in Korea. I told her you tell it better than I do." Robert studied his grandson's face, seeing traces of his own stubborn chin and his mother's gentle eyes, and felt the familiar warmth that came from being needed for something beyond medical attention. The war stories that had once seemed like ancient history to Billy now carried the weight of family legend, proof that Robert Thompson had always been a survivor, even when survival required accepting help from others. "Well now, Emma," Robert began, settling into the storytelling voice that had entertained grandchildren and VFW buddies for decades, "that was February of 1951, and the Chinese had us surrounded near a place called Chip-Yong-Ni. Temperature was about 20 below, and Tommy had taken shrapnel in his leg." As Robert's voice filled the living room, Martha paused in her kitchen preparations to listen. After 52 years of marriage, she knew this story by heart, could recite every detail of heroism and survival. But hearing Robert tell it now, with his hearing aid amplifying his own voice so he could modulate it properly, she heard something new. Gratitude instead of just pride, wonder instead of just accomplishment. Michael arrived from his final phone call of the day, a habit he'd maintained even during family holidays until his father's illness had rearranged his priorities. Now his phone stayed off during family gatherings, his Chicago practice managed by partners who had learned to handle complex cases without his constant supervision. The professional success that had once defined his identity remained important, but it no longer consumed his attention in ways that excluded the people who mattered most. "Dad, Dr. Chen called this morning," Michael announced, settling onto the couch beside Billy and Emma. "Your 6-week follow-up results came back perfect. No signs of infection recurrence, and the cancer screening was completely clear. She said to tell you that medically speaking, you're boring now." The laughter that followed was rich with relief and genuine joy. For months, every phone call from medical professionals had carried potential disaster. Now, boring was the most beautiful word the Thompson family could imagine. Martha called everyone to the table just as the autumn sun reached its zenith, streaming through windows that Robert had cleaned during his recovery as a way of contributing to household maintenance despite family protests that he should rest. The dining room table, extended with extra leaves to accommodate their expanded gathering, groaned under the weight of traditional dishes that represented decades of family memories. Robert took his customary seat at the head of the table, Martha to his left so he could hear her clearly, and looked around at faces that had sustained him through the darkest months of his 78 years. Billy and Emma sat side by side, young and optimistic in the way that only college students could manage. Sarah and her teenage daughter from her previous marriage shared quiet jokes about hospital food and family medical dramas. Michael and Janet maintained the comfortable friendship that had survived their divorce and been strengthened by shared concern for Robert's health. Mrs. Henderson beamed with the happiness of someone who had been unexpectedly included in celebration. "Before we eat," Robert said, his voice steady and clear, "I need to say something to all of you." The table quieted. Family members who had learned to listen carefully when the patriarch had something important to share. Outside, the November wind rustled through bare trees that would soon face the harsh Pennsylvania winter, but inside the Thompson house, warmth filled every corner. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting here today, healthy and surrounded by family, I would have called them crazy. 4 months ago, when I was too proud to admit I needed help, I almost lost everything that matters. 2 months ago, lying in that hospital bed, I thought I was going to be the reason this family fell apart. Martha's hand found his across the table, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had anchored their marriage through 5 decades of joys and sorrows. "But I learned something during these past months," Robert continued, his eyes moving from face to face around the table. "I learned that strength isn't about handling everything alone. It's about knowing when to let the people who love you help carry the load. I learned that pride can be the enemy of wisdom. And I learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing that could have happened." Billy raised his water glass in an impulsive toast. "To Grandpa's expired eardrops, the worst medicine that saved his life." The laughter was immediate and infectious, spreading around the table like the kind of family joke that would be retold for generations. But beneath the humor was genuine gratitude for the medical miracle that had transformed a story of stubborn pride into a testament to family love and unexpected providence. "To expired eardrops," Michael echoed, lifting his own glass. "And to families that stick together even when the patriarch is too stubborn to ask for help." "To Martha's prayers," Sarah added, "which apparently work even when the rest of us have given up." "To second chances," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 52 years of loving a difficult man through impossible circumstances. As they began to eat, conversation flowed around the table with the easy rhythm of people who had weathered crisis together and emerged stronger. Emma asked questions about family history that gave Robert opportunities to share stories beyond his war experiences. Mrs. Henderson contributed neighborhood gossip that kept everyone connected to their community. Michael discussed his plans to spend more time in Pennsylvania, possibly opening a satellite office in Pittsburgh. Sarah announced her acceptance into a graduate program specializing in geriatric care, inspired partly by her father's medical journey. Billy saved his news for dessert, standing beside his grandfather's chair with the kind of nervous energy that preceded important announcements. "Grandpa, Emma and I have been talking, and we've decided that when I graduate in May, I want to move back to Millfield for a couple of years. Help out with Grandma's Parkinson's, spend time with you while you're still healthy, maybe learn some things about life that they don't teach in college." Robert's response came without hesitation, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Billy, that's the best medicine any doctor could prescribe." Outside, November darkness was falling across the Pennsylvania landscape, but inside the Thompson house, light filled every room. They were not the same family that had gathered 12 months earlier. Illness, crisis, and recovery had changed them all in ways both profound and permanent. But they were stronger, closer, more honest about their love for each other than they had ever been. Some crossings, Robert reflected as he listened to his family's voices surround him. You don't know you've made them until you realize you can never go back to who you were before. And sometimes, that's exactly where you were meant to be, all along. Sometimes the worst mistakes become our greatest blessings in disguise. Robert Thompson's stubborn pride nearly killed him. Expired eardrops, months of denial, a dangerous infection that could have spread to his brain. But that same mistake led doctors to discover precancerous cells that would have become deadly within 2 years. His body was actually fighting to save his life in ways nobody understood. After 52 years of marriage, Martha watched her husband learn that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Their son Michael left his Chicago law practice to sit beside a hospital bed, rediscovering what truly matters. Their grandson Billy chose family over college deadlines, learning that love sometimes requires sacrifice. What began as a medical crisis became a family miracle. The hearing Robert lost in one ear was replaced by deeper listening to the voices that matter most. Pride had isolated him. Vulnerability brought his family closer than ever. Today, at their Thanksgiving table, 4 generations celebrate not just Robert's recovery but the truth that our greatest struggles often lead to our most profound gratitude. Sometimes we have to nearly lose everything to discover what we've had all along, the unconditional love of family who will fight alongside us through any battle. What moment in your life seemed like a disaster but later revealed itself as a blessing? Have you discovered that accepting help from family actually strengthened your relationships rather than weakened your independence? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might encourage someone else who's struggling with their own pride or family challenges.